The poem Childhood is by Marcus Nutton. It is an exploration of the loss of childhood and innocence, written from the perspective of someone who is no longer a child. It outlines the changes in perspective that coincide with growing up and paints a picture of disillusionment caused by loss of faith and innocence at a young age. Here is a summary of the poem Childhood by Marcus Nutton. In the first stanza, the poet begins by wondering whether his childhood ended with his 12th birthday. He wonders if he ceased to be a child when he realized that heaven and hell were not places that could be found in a geography book or an atlas, and so could not be said to exist at all. In other words, he wonders if he outgrew his innocence when he began to use reason and logic developed through education. In the second stanza, the poet wonders whether his childhood faded away due to the realization that all the adults around him were hypocrites. He wonders if he possibly ceased to be a child when he realized that adults only spoke of love and preached love. In real life, they did not behave in a loving manner and could be violent or mean. In the third stanza, the poet considers the possibility that his childhood ended when he realized that he was an individual with an independent mind which he could use as he saw fit. He realized that he could have original thoughts and was not to be limited by what others wanted him to think. In the last stanza, the poet declares that his childhood is now gone. He concludes emphatically that his childhood is now in a place that only an infant can access. He is now too grown up to be as innocent as a baby. The only character in the poem is the poet, who ponders over his lost childhood. The poet comes across as a self-aware and rational person. He is mindful of the fact that he has lost his innocence and that his thoughts have evolved over the years. His rational side is evident when he questions concepts like heaven and hell, whose existence he cannot perceive. The poet also seems to be cynical. He points out that adults do not always practice what they preach about being loving and kind. His musings about heaven and hell can be seen as the result of this cynicism as well. The poet is a strong individual who prizes his ability to think independently, as is evident from the manner he calls his mind my own and mine alone. Now let us examine the poem closely. The central theme of the poem is the loss of childhood and the change of perspective that is involved. Childhood is presented as a time of innocence, where the child believes everything that he or she is told. It is also shown to be a phase of trust in adults, with the child expecting people to live by what they preach. However, when a child develops the ability to observe, reason, and think independently, he or she ceases to be trusting and tends to be skeptical of many things. While contemplating the end of childhood, the poet also touches upon rationalism, the hypocrisy of adults, and individuality. The first stanza describes the awakening of a rational mind when the poet refuses to believe in things that cannot be perceived. The poet views this as the beginning of the move away from childhood and towards adulthood. In the second stanza, the poet describes his realization that adults' actions don't always match their words. They only talk about love, but do not demonstrate love towards fellow human beings. In the third stanza, the poet expresses the strength that he has gained from realizing that he was capable of independent thoughts. This realization helped him understand that his thoughts were unique. They were an expression of his individual identity, his own understanding of what it is like growing up in the world he lives in. The poem has a simple diction and structure. It is centered around a single question, and each stanza is the exploration of the possible answer to that question. In spite of its simplicity, the poem conveys its message powerfully. The poet has used anaphora liberally in the poem. Anaphora is a stylistic device where phrases are repeated for emphasis or structure. This is a literary device that can be found in texts as old as the Bible. Anaphora is commonly used in speeches and songs as well. The poet uses the question, "When or where did my childhood go?" at the beginning of each stanza in the poem. Another repeated phrase occurs at the end of each of the first 3 stanzas, as if to emphasize that each stanza is a response to the question asked in the first line. This repetition helps focus the attention of the reader to the central theme of the poem and also adds a rhythm to the poem. The poet uses different rhyme schemes in each stanza. The first and last lines are repeated across stanzas. There are 2 pairs of rhyming lines in the first stanza, 1 pair in the second stanza, and none in the third stanza. The decrease in rhyme seems to illustrate the distance from childhood expressed in each stanza. The concluding stanza reverts to a closed rhyme scheme of ABBA, emphasizing that the question asked in the first line has been answered to some extent.